Hi everyone. So I'm Hick from OMMX. We're an office of 8 people currently based in East London. I thought I'd introduce the office by just showing some of our work and I guess a bit of the trajectory of the practice to date. So we started off working on kind of private residences and works to listed and historic buildings, as you can kind of see here. And then gradually across the years, we've transitioned to kind of making cultural spaces and quite diverse commissions. So for example, the one on the right was a restoration of Rero Abbey through drawing, working with English heritage, through to fashion shoots for various designers staged within our drawings. And like I said, yeah, we've been working on cultural projects. So this is a kind of gallery in Paris for Marion Goodman. We do a lot of work with institutions like the V&A, doing exhibition making, as a lot of young practices do. And this is V&A Dundee Design Museum. But a lot of our work now is currently trying to help cultural institutes become much more inclusive and working with disadvantaged or marginalized groups, whether that's those with suffering from disability or these sorts of things. We also set up an initiative called Young Policymakers, working with young people and directly connecting them with basically policymakers in positions of power, talking about how the city can become more equitable and made for them. So we've been doing that sort of initiative. And I guess the third armature of the office is housing. This is Naked House, which is about to go to site, which is 22 affordable homes up in Enfield, through to kind of larger master plans. And we're currently waiting on planning for 300 homes in East London next to City Airport. Ooh. Stop sharing. If I can. Hang on. There we go.
Cool. Hopefully everyone can see the title page. And it's flipped through. Let me know if it hasn't. So we're nimtim architects. I'm Nim, and I run the studio with my husband and partner, co-director Tim. And we set up the practice about 10 years ago now. And a bit like Hick, we started off doing projects for sort of private residential clients. And that was quite an interesting process because we had to explain the way that architects work and our procurement and sort of, kind of the sort of legislation that's involved in getting a building built. And we originally started from our house. And I guess it was as a response to kind of getting a better work-life balance. So we've got 2 kids and a dog. So it's kind of juggling a practice of 10 people alongside that. And I guess something that we kind of learned early on is that a lot of what makes our work stand out, but also makes our work different, is that it is about really understanding our client and really understanding the needs of the user. And sort of so our projects look quite different, but what they sort of have in common is that they kind of reflect the personality and character of the client. Tim, I don't know if you want to add anything else.
Yeah, so we had a similar journey, I guess, as Hikaru. We started off doing a lot of private residential work, and we've kind of moved. I guess we've moved in more into we're doing a lot of landscape work, public realm work, and that's partly because Nimi has a kind of interest and qualification in landscape design. But yeah, I think we kind of evolved a sort of co-designing process through our work with homeowners, and we've kind of scaled that up to kind of work with communities, work with schools like this. So we're kind of still evolving as a practice and growing. And we are also working on some housing projects as well, and collaborative projects. But yeah, so that's a kind of brief history of the practice.
I guess what kind of led from the private resi stuff was this kind of dialogue and this kind of understanding the language and trying to make people become involved in the process. And so we spend a lot of time kind of listening and engaging and working together and bringing them on board, which kind of then kind of led itself to doing more community engagement work, working with children in schools or young adults and sort of other marginalized groups to make sure that their sort of needs are being heard within the built environment. And this then led us to kind of different types of recognition, but also different types of work. And this is one of our projects, which we'll come on to later, I think, but it's the Beacon Tree project, which is more of a public realms project, looking at kind of these forgotten spaces within the Beacon Tree estate, which is in Barking and Dagenham, and making them more open to the community that's around it, as well as, you know, encouraging new, you know, people that are new to the area to kind of activate the space. It also looked at reuse. So we managed to get a lot of things from the site. So for example, these blue kind of crankshafts were from the local Ford factory, which is where a lot of the people in the area would have worked or had a kind of relationship over time with. And we got these large pieces of stone from the kind of the super sewer that's going on in kind of Westminster. And so it was like kind of bringing all these kind of objects into a kind of a different environment and activating the space through them. I think that was it. Oh, and then this is our last one. Sorry, do you want to talk about it, Tim?
Yeah, so we're also doing a lot of collaborative projects with larger practices, working on larger developments of 100, 200 homes. In this instance, we're working on the landscape, public realm, and a shared play space. This is in Southwark, not far from our office, just off the Old Kent Road. And so it's been quite interesting working with different architects at a larger scale. How can we bring a different voice or a different perspective on things? And this has been interesting, finding a way to bring a different kind of architectural language and expression into a housing scheme where, you know, there are restrictions in terms of what the housing can do and what the architecture can do was quite significant. So being able to bring in a different kind of voice and a different kind of architectural expression has been really interesting. So this is on site at the moment, and we're excited to see it complete in the next year.
Well, thank you for introducing yourselves. And now that we're all acquainted, let's dig into the questions. And the first question that I'd like to pose tonight is, how do all of you use drawing in your practice?
Do you want to start, Hick, or do you want us to?
Up to you. After you.
Well, maybe we're happy to go first. I guess for us, we use drawing in lots of different ways. And so we put together just some examples of the different types of representation of spaces that we have within the practice, which can be quite loose, for example, and sort of give a sense of feeling to the space. It can also be more like a kind of exploded acto, which kind of gives more context and shows kind of how the architecture might sit within its local and immediate environment. It can also be sort of moments, and we've got, as we said, we're a sort of team of 10, and each person sort of likes to represent things in different ways, and we've always been really keen on celebrating that and not being too stuck on a certain style, and also not being too rigid. I think from our experience of working with clients, it's about everyone being able to interpret the drawings so that they can almost inhabit them. So it can't be too fixed, if that makes sense. These are some drawings where we also use the figures to show when we're sort of detailing on site as well, the kind of technical drawings, to just make sure that everything's kind of considered, looking at how people might actually use the space or the architecture or the place. Yeah, and we also really like color. I think color is a really nice way of elevating drawing and getting more personality, and kind of feeling into the drawings.
I think for us, it's a lot about communication drawings, and so deciding what you want to communicate and what kind of what's the important thing that you want to speak about within a drawing, and that will depend on the stage of the project and who you're trying to communicate with. So Nimi, if you go back to the first slide in the sequence, one thing we've found quite interesting when we're going for bids, for instance, or at kind of early concept stage of projects. This was quite a large collaboration that we undertook with some large practices. But these drawings are quite helpful at that stage because there's not that much idea about what we're going to do in terms of the architecture itself. It's more about a feeling and kind of communicating a feeling about what the intention is about the space. So this is a view of what is currently a massive gyratory system in East London. And the idea was to kind of communicate an idea of kind of bringing green through having tall buildings, but then creating kind of sense of intimacy below those buildings. So a drawing like this is actually much more successful than something much more detailed in terms of kind of conveying what the intent is for something. And because people can't see any detail on it, they will apply their own idea of what that might be. So you don't get bogged down in questions about style or opening or material. It's really just about the kind of quality of the space. And in the example of this drawing, the figures are kind of front and center. It's about activity. It's about what people might do in that space. So I think that's something we've found really useful. And I think, Nimi, if you go on to the next few slides, which then the next one maybe, which then go down to really much more intimate kind of scale. We find working with homeowners, it's also about moments and sort of celebrating the kind of everyday life, which people can sometimes be uncomfortable talking about and sort of saying, well, I'd really like to be able to do this in this sort of day, or have an experience like this when we have lots of friends over. But drawing it and kind of showing what those moments might be like can be really powerful. So we do these kind of drawings right at the beginning of a project, and they can become kind of guiding lights in terms of where the project wants to go, even though they might be very kind of low in detail and specifics. They become really central to what people want to achieve and what they want us to help them bring to the project. Hick, over to
you. Bear with me while I just fumble my way through sharing my screen. Can you see that? Cool. Yeah, so I think as Nimi and Tim were describing, we have different drawings for different audiences. So I'd just show a random assortment to give us a sense of the sorts of drawings that we're making. So this one we made during COVID, and it was about the space of production. So it was kind of literally our desk. You can see two little eyes underneath the desk hiding, but sort of this being our interface to the world around, view out to the city that we can no longer visit, kind of talking to people through windows, these sorts of things, and just reflecting on how that affected our perspective on what we wanted to do going out back into the world. The drawing was called A Second Shot, a second chance to kind of question what architectural practice and production could be. We of course produce more conventional architectural drawings. So this is an elevation on the left. but we're also simultaneously testing it and kind of the life it can sustain and contain and hopefully, you know, catalyze on the right. They're complete speculations, I guess, the act on thing on the right. Again, more conventional drawings, I guess. Perspectives, I guess, for the people here are just giving a sense of scale. They're not really doing anything, actually. When I look at them, they're quite aimless. Similarly, these sorts of things. There's a kind of economy to putting these images together as well, and how much time you have about people, and show activity and use and these sorts of things. This was a drawing that we did as a kind of critical reflection of, we called it Dressing Down Parliament, and it was when Brexit was happening, and it was our kind of, it was for Lisbon Triennale and our kind of statement on making room for other forms of expression. So we were talking about stripping the building of all its ornament, or part of its ornament, to kind of redress and reclothe. And that was a kind of segue for me to talk about a very different sort of drawing that we do in the office, where we're working directly with communities. So on the left, this was we were shortlisted for Canning Dock, for the redevelopment of Canning Dock, which we led a team on. And we were kind of we had to produce a drawing in a pavilion at once. So on the left, we created a table that was a map of Liverpool that we kind of, or exploded. You can see it on the right, so it's kind of back-breaking work. And then we planted that table. And then we hosted workshops with Resolve Collective, and also just created spaces for play to discuss Liverpool's history and just the lived experience of living there, regardless of that history of the site. And we asked people to kind of share their stories on the tables with graffiti pens, and create doodles and drawings themselves, and, you know, little anecdotes through to yeah, almost a record of our conversations that we're having with them. The kind of grey tables became festooned in colour, and then we used that as a brief for creating a drawing, kind of a large-scale drawing of the hopes and ambitions of the residents there of Liverpool, and also those further afield, kind of talk about this site and what it could be. I don't know if you know the site at the minute, but it's pretty much a vacant, derelict site at the heart of Liverpool. And then another type of drawing, so it was going back to kind of young policymakers. I thought this was quite beautiful. We created some billboards, and someone drew this kind of graffiti over the top, and that kind of conversational aspect to drawing. Our work this was a workshop with kids asking them to draw their homes and how it made them feel. And they were kind of drawing over the pavers of their playground, through to working, and that was with a very young group of school children, versus kind of working with teenagers. And so this is a kind of much more ambitious scale. We kind of set up, you can't really see it, a very faint drawing in kind of lemon yellow. It was really almost invisible map of London, capturing the postcodes that they live in. And then we kind of asked them to draw kind of 3 meters, I think, by 3 meters, possibly bigger, their lived experience of London over 3 sessions. And so this is us kind of structuring and guiding that sort of conversation, and the drawing becoming a document or a map of that, and also somehow psychogeography and those sorts of things, I guess. It had its limitations, I'd say, insofar as, just stop sharing 1 sec, insofar as I think it was probably a bit exclusive, expecting people to all use one medium, like a pen. So it would have been nice, we felt it would have been nicer to also augment it with capturing oral stories and conversations and these sorts of things. But yeah, that was another type of drawing we would share.
Thanks. So that leads me to our second discussion question, which is actually kind of a compound question, and it focuses on the user. So how can we think about figures in architectural drawings as users, and how do users appear in your work at all stages? And how do the figures in architectural drawings help to articulate ideas about spaces and the spaces themselves?
Should we go first again?
Up to you. I'm sorry, if you'd like me to go, I can.
I don't mind. We can share. Hopefully, this is going to flick. We were going to talk about one project in particular, actually, in response to that question, which was, and it's a project, but it's quite a small, really small space. It's about a loo. It's about a toilet, a bathroom, and we were asked to sort of think about what the bathroom of the future might be, and do some designs as part of a competition run by Architecture Today magazine. And I guess a lot of our work is always starts off with thinking about the user and people. And I guess a bathroom's a really interesting space because a lot of people use it, and you could be a huge age range. You know, you could be from naught to kind of 80. It's your lifetime. You're going to be using a bathroom, and so we really thought about the user and the different kind of criteria of people that might be using this space, and created these kind of datums depending on their age, and we called it loo of a lifetime. And the idea was that it was this really adaptive space that could accommodate all the users, um, all the different ages of users and all the needs of those users. So, you might have kind of a mum with a baby, and you've got space for the baby to play. You've got a kind of fold down seat that's by the bath so that the mum can sit and watch the baby in the bath. You've got kind of drying racks that can be brought down so that she can dry the clothes, because there's always a lot of washing and drying. And then we thought about, how when that child gets older and becomes a bit more sort of, sort of maybe an 8-year-old, how they might need to sort of be more independent. So they've got like little steps to kind of use the basin. And then, as you get older, you need things to be easier. So you might have a washing machine that could be adapted to be put in at high levels, so it stops you bending down as you get older. So it was this really adaptive space that could be working really, really hard and be potentially modular, so it could be adapted, so you could kind of change it as you grew, or as your needs changed. And so this was a project that we really, really focused on the user, and actually I think it was really enlightening, and we had lots of chats in the office about what people need from their bathroom as a user, and it was really interesting.
And we use the figures in the drawings to inform the design. So, actively responding to the figure in the drawing, rather than adding it at the end. I mean, I think in the exhibition, a lot of the figures seem to have been added on as a kind of like dressing of the drawing to kind of enliven it. In this case, we were kind of very much trying to kind of let the drawing be informed and the design be informed by the figure. And obviously scale is an interesting thing. So we kind of developed very specific figures that responded to the ages that we were kind of trying to design for. I mean, it was interesting because there was even friction within the office, because obviously we have different people at different stages of their life and we all were kind of had different priorities about what we thought this loo of a lifetime should be doing. But I think it's quite useful to kind of insert the figures and think about different datums and how we could kind of really make this space work harder. So that was kind of example of where the figure was really kind of part of the design process in the way that we drew. Hick, over to you.
Yeah, I'm just sharing 2 secs.
And while he's sharing, I'll just say that I think that that's such a great observation that in the exhibition, the figures sort of come last. And that's definitely what the sort of practice was like in the 18th century, early 19th century. And now, in many ways, it seems like the figure comes first.
So I thought I'd answer this by talking about users in the broadest of senses, and sets of drawings that we do that aren't necessarily related to a project per se, but the practice of producing architecture. So here it's a kind of drawing of a quarry and thinking of the user as, you know, a user of architecture is the person employed to, you know, start to mine material or natural landscapes that are literally scarred through the making of architecture. Then the making of architecture itself. So on the left are drawings of people producing architecture within our office itself, and the kind of digital production of architecture, and as well as on the right, the actual makers themselves, the contractors, the subcontractors, foremen, and also the selling of architecture. So I'm not sure if you can see in the right, it's a construction site, and at the very bottom of the image is a hoarding dressed with, you know, the buildings that are coming and people passing by. Then the image on the left is kind of, this pairing is the life and death of buildings. So on the left, it's, yes, the people inhabiting it and who use it in that sense, but also the people who are cleaning, maintaining, looking after, who in our, it's kind of equally important to kind of think about. And on the right, I'm not sure if you can see, but it's the moment of the tower collapsing and demolished, but from the viewpoint of someone who lives quite far away, and this idea that we all have relationships to the architecture. It's not just the people who commission it or inhabit and live it within it. And it's kind of, you know, spilt milk and all of this stuff, but talking about memory and these sorts of things. And then kind of thinking about what happens to all that built material after, yeah, all that material culture after building is kind of unceremoniously taken apart. So then another type of way of thinking about users, I was thinking, was also about kind of atmospheres and the way that spaces make you feel as well. So you as a viewer of an image also being a user, but also, let's say, in addition to the people inhabiting the image. So this is Rebo Abbey again. But then how we can take those feelings and start, and I guess, you know, these images have a fairly melancholic atmosphere, and try and project that into the space. So how a house can start, or how those feelings of, let's say, the melancholic church be domesticated somehow, and the figure within that in the backdrop. Here, the figure, I thought, you know, this was for a project where we were talking about loneliness a lot and estrangement, and actually it feeling very everyday. And, you know, the figures are both looking at you, it's Gogglebox, or I think that's what it's called, and someone's feet just in the bottom right with Deliveroo, and how contemporary culture is kind of creating those feelings of estrangement within the city. And talk about this. The everyday. So here is just being bored. We're using figures to just talk about, you know, being bored in the city and what that could be like. Some of our projects, we're really just looking at people passing by and not really, you know, it is a very gloomy wet afternoon, much like today. And the user being people just walking by fleetingly. Sometimes we have to exaggerate the user in the image and what they're doing. So here we're proposing a wall that played music or whispered to you. So I think that the image is taken from a sitcom. And then I thought I'd talk about images where we have talked about users just through the stuff they bring, so the materials that they bring. So on the left, we were asked to kind of produce an image responding to the Albaz's kind of photographic study of these monuments in Mexico. And we just kind of completed the margin of the image, showing the stuff that tourists bring, so kind of souvenirs, trash, kind of a layer of detritus that is outside of the frame of the idealized image. And then I guess finally how that has kind of informed our thinking on housing and how we create images and also buildings to contain that mess and stuff of life. This was an animation, but it's not working. I'm really sorry. I don't know why. I think it's because I'm using online office, but yeah, there you go.
Thanks. So that brings us to our third and final question before we open things up to the audience, which is about media. So obviously in the exhibition and in the 18th and 19th century, we would have been using drawing, with photography being later introduced. But now we have a sort of range of media, including social media, available for shaping architectural thought. And I wondered, what other kinds of media are you using? How does it work? And how does this differ from drawing?
This was quite an interesting question because it the parallel with the exhibition is that I think well, one difference is that we have photography now, so that they would never have had at that time they wouldn't have had the opportunity to photograph completed buildings. So in a sense, we have a new way of communicating a building, a completed one, or a space. And I guess what's kind of interesting is the kind of introduction of the figure into the architectural drawing in the exhibition. I think there's something similar has happened recently. And when we were at architecture school 20 years ago, it kind of felt like all the pictures of architecture didn't have any people in them. They were always kind of like very kind of sculptural kind of expressions of the building, devoid of any humanity or kind of or any kind of life. And I think that's something that we've always felt really strongly about, I think, along with lots of architects of our generation. So we have always been really keen to have figures in our buildings, in our completed photos. So Nimi, do you want to
yeah.
So I mean, these are some of the kind of completed homes, but we're always nagging our clients or people to kind of be in the photos, because that's what it's all about. And I mean, we're even trying to kind of, we've got an idea, we want to try and move even more into kind of expressing the reality of how people live. And people will quite often tidy up for when we have a photo shoot, but we're kind of trying to persuade people to leave things as they are, within reason, so that you kind of get a true expression of how space is being used and the kind of life within it. So yeah, it's an interesting one, and there's maybe a bit of a kind of discussion within the office about like how far do we push it? Like, can we kind of just like just turn up and tell people not to do any tidying, like do it on the worst, like after a weekend with the kids at home or whatever? There's a different kind of aesthetic, but it's kind of more of a kind of honest reflection of how things are happening in the spaces. And I think that's an interesting change. And I think you see a lot, especially a lot of interior photography. That's a kind of trend to really photograph it in its real, genuine state, rather than trying to kind of tidy it or make a kind of aspirational version of it.
Yeah, I think in the exhibition and a lot of art historically, drawings and even the photos of the buildings, they've always kind of, like Tim says, been really pristine. It's like the the end image is always like the person is added on for effect or something, rather than being integral to the picture or the building. And I think yeah, we're really excited about things getting messy and things being used and showing people making their mark on something, however individual that is. So these are some models that we use for engagement that we do. This was one from Ledbury, which was the project in Southwark on off Old Kent Road that Tim talked about earlier. This is for Spitalfields Farm, just looking at different ways that that can work. Tim touched on kind of getting our clients involved in all the photos, which is quite fun. And then lastly, the final thing that I guess influences us is, and you mentioned it as well, Erin, social media. So it's always really interesting to see, we love it actually, to see our clients posting stuff up, and it shows how they've inhabited the space or how the kids have like adapted the space for their party, or for Christmas, how the space has changed. And I think that influences us as well, of sort of thinking, well, it's going to be, we kind of really want our clients to take ownership of the projects, and to have the kind of strength and the kind of imagination to just make it their own and to do that. And I think social media is something that influences us as well quite a lot in terms of, yeah, how figures are going to inhabit spaces. Hick, over to you seamlessly.
Hick, you're on mute. You're on mute.
Repeat what I just said, it's kind of awkward. No, I think I was just saying, I think we share quite a lot in terms of sensibility and approach and outlook in that regard. When Erin asked this question, I thought we'd share kind of pet project. I think it's more than a pet project, actually. It's something that we're working up with the photographer that we've been working with for close to a decade now, Max Creasy, who does, you know, he has his own art practice in which he's taking a lot of portraits and these sorts of things. It's very different. He's also an architectural photographer. But I got, through lengthy conversations with him, I was kind of lamenting that kind of idealized image of architecture, which only exists at one moment at the opening and these sorts of things, and doesn't really reflect much about the culture of building or things that I'm particularly interested in. So we talked about how we could start to capture much more ephemeral relations, and particularly the friendships that we've forged over the years with people making our projects, and trying to document that and a different culture of building and way of making, and thinking about how that informs the way we design. So here's a kind of some of those photos I thought I'd share. Okay, yeah. And we've been trying to kind of capture moments on site, and also of, you know, the things being put together and made, but also the maker and who they are and the stories behind them, as well as the details. So yeah, we haven't really shared any of this because it is in a way quite a very personal project. I think we will at some point. But yeah, we just wanted to document this sort of time and just the care that I think if you show care in your work, you're also showing it to the people who are often the unsung heroes. Yeah, this guy was kind of amazing, actually. He's talking about how he put his life back on track, kind of trained to make things and gone to jail and, you know, all of this stuff. And he ends up on this construction site doing all the welding. Yeah, it's got quite a beautiful conversation with him, and just about life. It just really grounds you. Anyway, I just share that.
Hick, it reminded me a bit of the sketches that they were in the exhibition of John Soane's sites. And there's the kind of architectural apprentice like going up the big staircase with the kind of the bricklayers in the background. So it's nice to kind of like, because architects rarely invest in the photos on site. It's kind of like, you know, we invest in the drawings and then we invest in the kind of photographs at the end. and then there's that whole kind of bit in between, which is kind of the most exciting bit in most ways, that is rarely documented.
I think that's such a great observation. And it reminded me of the sewn drawings as well. One of the things that was really great was we did an exhibition, not last year, the year before, with Grafton Architects, and they commission, very sort of strangely, among architects, commission photographers to document that sort of middle stage where you have a structure, but then nothing is filling it yet, so that they can document what the project looks like halfway through the process, which I think is so interesting. And I think really is kind of important because it will give future generations, you know, when we're all dead, future generations will see, oh, this is how people used to work and used to build, and you know, acts as a really important, I guess, source for, you know, how we operated. So glad that Hick is keeping track of these things. I think it's great, and hopefully you'll all start doing it.
I should have paused 1 second because I actually really love the photo of this dude on the left, because he's got a Darth Vader t-shirt on. I'm not sure if you can see. He's wearing this mask welding, and it's quite a magical moment seeing him. Yeah, it's these accidental moments you can't plan in a drawing, and you just have to like capture, and that's like the art of great photography. I think it's less staged; it's more just like, yeah, finding that.
But also, when we've shared the photos of like on site and stuff, the reaction from everyone has been really positive. And so if we shared it on our social media or something, everyone's like, oh my God, wow, that's amazing. And you think, oh yeah, I forgot. Because for us, it is exciting, but you see it a lot and you sort of forget that other people, they want to see, it's almost like a magic trick, and they want to see the workings behind it, and it really interests them. And so it's quite nice to be reminded that it is, yeah, for a lot of people, it's, you know, that they don't know that welding goes into kind of an art exhibition or whatever, you know, that those are the kind of people that are involved in it. It's quite nice.
Yeah, it's funny because when we introduce visitors to the Sewn Museum and its collections, there's a few collections that people are always really, really interested to find out exist. One is that set of drawings that Sewn did of building sites. And another is a collection that we have, which we refer to as the Building Archive, which is basically bits of the Sewn Museum that have fallen off or been replaced over time and have been kept. So we have things like stones that crows have dropped through the windows. We have things like bits of ephemera that builders have left behind as like time capsules. We have like bits of glass that have been swapped out with new glass because they weren't fit for purpose anymore. And I think we as professionals forget that actually it's this sort of mystified process that actually is really sort of captivating people's imaginations. I think that might be a good point to turn to the audience on. I have one question here, which is about co-production models, which is, I think, something that all of you touched on. And I think the person who asked this question wanted to know why co-production models are so important now.
I think they're a useful way to break the ice. I think sometimes people often think that there's a preconception to having the language, and a lot of people don't have that language. You know, it may be that English isn't their first language, but it also might be that they're really young and they just don't know how to describe it. And so we use the models and games as kind of informal ways to get people talking and to get people thinking about spaces in different ways. And what's really nice is actually seeing the response, especially from the children or young adults, because often they've not been academically strong, because the ways that you're tested academically is all the same. You know, you have to do exams, etc. But when we do workshops or when we do engagement sessions and we have models or games and we're we're sort of talking about more sort of, I don't know, I guess thinking about their critical thinking a bit more, and thinking a bit more about how you use the space. It's lovely to see people that are often unexcited about education or unexcited about sort of articulation become really expressive. And I think models are an easy way to kind of to aid that conversation.
Yes, for me, like the co-production angle is what, like, yeah, it's really important because it's about kind of getting the brief right and being transparent and accountable all the way through the design. And I think that probably, I might be wrong, but probably that's the best way of unlocking value from every penny spent. To avoid white elephants, to avoid things that are not important to the people who it's meant to be for, those sorts of things. And if you can kind of steer the conversations at the earliest point, you can avoid those sort of mistakes of the past, or and you can really ensure that you're doing something valuable, or at least trying to, or you can kind of narrow the route there, if you see what I mean.
I think it's about a bottom-up approach, isn't it? That rather than a top-down. And as to why it's important now, I think it's just that we've kind of finally realised that that is the right way to do it. That you have to start with what people want, or a kind of reflection of what people's ambitions are or expectations are of the project, rather than imposing those onto them. And so co-design and kind of co-production is a way of doing that. Is kind of a way of ensuring that their voices are heard and expressed within the kind of project outcomes.
So we have a comment in the Q&A box, which has said that they like the pictures of the sort of everyday, which is perhaps the most overlooked experience of all. And I think that all of you sort of touched on the everyday. And one of the things that has emerged, I think, in my work with practicing architects is that there is a lot more interest in the everyday, in sort of accessible materials rather than the rarefied. And I wonder if you could all speak to that a little bit. Oh, not all at once.
But yeah, I think it's like I think our drawings that we showed with of kind of domestic spaces. A lot of clients feel a bit, like I said, they feel a bit uncomfortable sometimes talking about it. But actually, we want to really try and dig down into kind of like what is considered kind of boring everyday things, because actually, that's the kind of 99% of what architecture supports, is the kind of, you know, everyday life. So trying to understand how it can make that better, make that more fairer, more accessible, is really important. So yeah, and then again, I guess maybe a difference from some of the things in the exhibition, which was about much more about kind of public and much more kind of formal occasions. I guess the one exception was Piranesi's drawings, which are quite atmospheric because of it, but because he was drawing these kind of ruins that had kind of people looking after animals or sleeping, or kind of they're kind of the exception, and maybe why they resonate so strongly with us now. That they were the kind of they're the kind of exception, because he wasn't trying to sell, he's not trying to sell something in a sense, he's kind of trying to evoke an atmosphere. So those drawings are kind of maybe the closest that you get to this kind of expression of everyday life.
I guess, I think also oh, sorry, Hick. I was just going to say, we spend a long time listening and trying to work out what the everyday moments are. And I think a lot of people, like Tim said, are a bit embarrassed about those everyday moments. But actually, when you get talking to them about those moments, whatever they might be, they're really passionate about them and they're really important to them. And it's what brings them joy. And so, for example, you know, somebody might have a really beaten up chair, and that's the chair that they go to sulk in, and that's a really everyday thing. And sometimes they're often, you know, they're a bit coy about it or embarrassed, but actually that chair has a big importance in their life because it brings them a joy. You know, that's where they can go. Um, and I think it is really important to kind of tease those out from people, and almost try to find the bits of joy in amongst their lives, because it's almost like those are the reasons why you do something. It's the reasons why, you know, you enjoy your house, because you have those moments, and those should be the things that you celebrate and have like prominence and importance.
I guess in terms of, I just find the everyday incredibly relatable, obviously. And I think that that's where I found a kind of mismatch between what my formal education in architecture was being at the time, and my lived experience. You know, even now, when it comes to like master planning or these things, I think back to when I was a kid, and I would try and find like dark, dingy alleyways to do stupid stuff in with my mates, because it was out of sight of adults, and it was out of sight of my parents, and I could feel like I was, you know, growing as a person with my peers, I guess, in a way. Like that, even that sounds too high, lofty. It's just like, I think we all do it, and that's a very human desire, and I think that's how you make cities more humane and livable. And I also think that the everyday is relatable to the more people, it's more relevant because it impacts everyone somehow. Everyone can access it, and yeah, it's part of, I guess, the production of architecture and the political production of architecture as well. You think of it that way. The extraordinary often becomes like incredibly elitist. You obviously get the extraordinary every day, but you know what I mean.
It also becomes very alienating, you know, like you were saying, like when you're young and you kind of just want to see yourself reflected in things. And I think if it is too kind of, yeah, this big moment, it becomes very alienating and you can feel very lonely. And I don't think sometimes those images or pictures were supposed to make you feel like that, but that was something to strive towards. But it never felt like something that you could inhabit or that was part of your world. And I think it's a bit to its detriment, actually. And I think that's what's happening now. I think people are starting to realize that actually the more successful things are the everyday, and where you can see yourself reflected back in it.
I think that's a really good point, because when we get visitors to the Stone Museum is so, I think, overwhelming in the amount of stuff that has in it, and in the fact that you, as a person who live in a home, can't imagine yourself living there, because there's so much stuff, and it's so specific. And so a lot of times when we have visitors to the museum, they are interested in things like the kitchens and the plumbing, and how did people cook on low stoves, and what did Stone's bathroom look like. And they're always interested to know, for example, that Mrs. Stone preferred a chamber pot in a water closet, and Mr. Stone wanted like everything sort of new and plumbed in, and like two totally different attitudes. And I think it is because this idea of the everyday is so relatable to us. I think we have time for one final question. And that is that all of you talked at one point or another about feeling, which seems in a lot of ways really far removed from function, and certainly is really far removed from how 18th century architects were sort of representing buildings almost as status symbols. And so the question here is kind of, how do you balance feeling and function?
I don't really have a proper answer, but I think quite personally, like fairly intuitively. I think also within the office, it's fairly intuitive. It's not a very rational process. I
But it was
guess that's where it's
interesting.
important to have lots of I guess, different lived experiences around the table, and so that you can strike a balance that isn't selfish in that way. But
it was interesting your drawing that was kind of melancholic. I thought that was kind of quite an interesting, because I guess you don't tend to make drawing, like if you're kind of showing something to clients, you tend not to kind of create melancholic imagery, but it's an interesting one. I was wondering, I don't know if that was for a client, but I wondered, you know, how that landed, because actually it's kind of, we tend to kind of aim for spaces that kind of feel you know, joyful or enlivening, or you know, but it's interesting that there ought to be space for buildings and architecture that is more melancholic, I guess, like the church that you showed. But it's a kind of interesting it was interesting to see a drawing like that, and I'm just wondering, like, if it was for a client or whether it was just a kind of explorative thing.
yeah, it was for a client. I don't know, like some of the work maybe exposes darker tendency in people we work with. I don't know. No, I personally, speaking for myself, like I get quite, like, architecture's driven so much, like the stuff that gets built, by like marketing and the image of making people happy and all of this stuff, and I find it actually a bit dystopian, and not at all honest or real. So I think, yeah, maybe it's in response to that. I mean, we do those drawings as well. Again, it depends on the audience, but I often find myself struggling when I walk around new developments, thinking about how I would have fit in as a child growing up, or my family would have fit in, or I feel they're all quite alienating. And yeah, I think there's room and should be space for other sorts of emotions. I remember, like, yeah, having a fight with my parents once, and then just like trying to find a quiet space in central London where I could be kind of upset, and like walking down an alley and finding something, and that actually being really valuable and being quite vulnerable in that space, out, you know, in the center of London, but somehow cocooned through a different type of space that you would, yeah, kind of left over not the marketing shot, if you see what I mean. I don't know how else to describe it, and I guess being an advocate for those sorts of spaces as well.
When we do our when we do our initial discussions with clients for private homes, and we sometimes use these techniques for communities as well, we have like little icons for like activities that you might do. And so those activities might be reading, might be kind of cooking or eating. But we also have ones like arguing and sulking, and we have blank ones where people can kind of write in their own feelings or emotions. And that's, I think, when things start to get really interesting in the discussions, because it's like, you know, normally there's a few stakeholders around the table. So it's like, you know, where do you argue? What we do we argue? Like, where do you go to sulk? Where do people go to play? Where do people go to come together? So when you embed it that early in the process and it's become part of the briefing for the project, then feeling is embedded within the kind of process of creating the architecture. So I mean, I think you just have, you know, in terms of where does feeling fit in, if you start talking about it, then it will be part of the project and can become part of the brief. So I think there's that, I mean, that's what we found.
And I think feeling should be part of it. I mean, who was it who said form follows function? Was that Mies van der Rohe? I can't remember. One of the greats. And that was what you were always taught. You were taught form follows function. But actually, I think feeling and function are much more related and should be talked about more, and should be given more prominence. Because and those feelings can be whatever feelings you want, whether they're negative or positive. But if those functions relate to the feelings, then that space will be successful, and that space will be joyful, even if you are doing a negative feeling, you know, because you've got a space to do that. So I think feeling follows function, or function follows feeling, but definitely form is secondary.
Yeah, it sort of gets back to what you were saying about the old chair and having needs to have a place because it's fulfilling. Its function is really supporting the feeling. And I think that's a really great note to end on. So thank you all for joining us tonight. And thank you to our panel participants for giving us some time out of their evening. And good evening to everyone. Bye.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.